Hi, thanks for staying on with us here on the news feed. Newsroom Africa, channel 405, and your reporting continues now. And this is a story that we have been talking about much of the day today. The Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, yesterday released an economic strategy blueprint for South Africa to boost growth and create jobs. The 77-page report drew from existing proposals in other documents, including the NDP. So, will it work? And what is different about this plan? For more on this, I'm joined in studio by Economist Ndumiso Hadebe. It's good to see you, sir.
Thanks for having me, Thabo.
So, are we abandoning the National Development Plan? Is this a new document? I mean, these are questions that people will keep on asking. Say, well, every time you give us a plan, you don't implement the plan, it's great on paper, you just simply abandon it, you come up with another paper, and we discuss that, and you promise to implement it, and it just keeps going and going. Is this something vastly different from what is in the NDP?
Well, this document is slightly different in that it's a bit more modest compared to the National Development Plan. The National Development Plan had envisaged to realize a growth rate of 5% per annum after achieving some of the reforms that the document had said that need to be instituted. But as well, with this particular document, the main assumption is indeed that there is a capable, ethical, and developmental state. So in as much as there are all of these reforms or suggestions that have been made through this economic policy document, it's still based on the assumptions that indeed we do have a capable development state that is able to institute or promulgate all of these reforms that have been highlighted in this policy document.
So talk about network industry, saying if we modernize these industries and we get them functioning well, if we lower barrier to entry, if we encourage labor-intensive sectors like agriculture and services, and we focus on flexible industrial policy and promote their exports and competitiveness, we're a far away.
Well, it's one of those things. Again, I think the precursor for any investment or for any growth is indeed good governance. But those industries or sectors that have been highlighted are the sectors that we refer to as labor-intensive and have high employment multipliers. So we've seen in research literature where you see that sectors such as tourism, construction, manufacturing, even media and broadcasting, those are sectors that have high employment multipliers as a result. Even if the government were to employ an intensive tax incentive in those specific industries, that's where we see the highest number of jobs being created. And this particular plan speaks to that kind of idea. But he also directs towards ensuring a prospect of South Africa being more competitive in the global arena, particularly with respect to industries such as manufacturing and agriculture and agro-processing, because we know that a lot of South African goods that are either manufactured, assembled, or produced in South Africa do have a big export market in the UK, in the US, and some parts in the continent as well.
Let's look at then what he wants to do as far as energy is concerned in terms of Eskom. Of course, the unbundling, we know that it's going to happen. And he says we need an independent transmission company that is able to buy energy from everywhere, including from households.
So that's quite an interesting one, because in his policy plan, he speaks of a 450 billion rand sale of coal-powered power plants owned by Eskom. So there are two perspectives to look at that particular question or that policy intervention. One is from a financial perspective. A sale of 450 billion rand would offset the current debt of 400 billion rand that Eskom currently has. But there are also economic questions that we need to ask. What would be some of the implications when it comes to job, to stimulating aggregate demand in the South African economy, and what does it mean for the sustainability of reliable and affordable energy supply in South Africa? More so as well, given the recent occurrences with respect to climate change and the effect that coal-powered energy supplies have had in local communities in terms of their health. But we've also seen the incidence of climate change in Durban, in Knysna, and in Mozambique quite recently, which also becomes quite an important economic consideration with respect to this new mixed power supply that he also speaks of in the document.
Well, I mean, it seems to be of the view that let's increase competitiveness. Let's increase rivalry here. Some good rivalry. This will work for the economy. So get somebody to come and compete with Eskom aggressively in terms of supply of energy.
And I think that could only work. And it speaks to this idea of reimagining the purpose of some of the state-owned entities that we have in South Africa, because the primary mandate of Eskom is to ensure that they're able to supply reliable energy at an affordable rate for consumers and businesses alike. Why that is important is because it serves as a competitive edge from other regions across the world or other emerging markets that we're competing with, such as Brazil, Indonesia, China, to ensure that if they set up manufacturing plants, which attracts labor-intensive jobs that we so much need, then we have a competitive edge over our peers, and that becomes quite important. And of course, we have a love of Eskom to want to try and keep things as they are, but then at the end of the day, we need to look at what is the mandate of Eskom, and is the current structural organogram of Eskom servicing that mandate? If not, it means that there are hard decisions that need to be made.
But is there political appetite for this type of decision? Because as you're mentioning, if you shut down those coal-powered power stations, you're literally losing jobs. And where are you going to take those jobs? How are you going to scale them, and where are you going to place them?
Those are the important questions, because even in offsetting or restructuring of Eskom, as it were, there needs to be a thorough plan as to say what will then be the macroeconomic interventions as to what would happen to folks who would be losing their jobs in that particular sector. And it's important that this discussion happens now so that there isn't a rampant negative effect to the South African economy, because of course when there's a loss of jobs, it means that there's a decreased aggregate demand in the South African economy, and we would foreseeably realize subdued growth that we've been experiencing in the recent times.
Is the blueprint short on that detail?
It's quite comprehensive, because it also speaks to a number of enablers, fundamental enablers, related to water supply, transportation, infrastructure. All of these things then become enablers for other offset industries. And one of the key enablers as well to all the reforms that this policy speaks to is the transformation of the reforms that need to take place in the telecoms industry. Right. There will be an auctioning of spectrum, of course, by the Minister of Telecoms, which there's numerous literature around the impact of a 10% broadband penetration in a specific region has a resultant impact in 1% GDP growth. So all of those things can offset some of the potential retrenchments that may come as a result of the restructuring that can come from Eskom. But of course, we need to think about this thing from a coordination and cooperation perspective to ensure that we're able to realize the foreseeable results.
He seems to say, well, look, let's set aside a small portion of the network to be under government control, but let's open up the rest of the spectrum to allow for competition to come in. In fact, saying, I don't know what he means, says the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, that's ICASA, proposed economic regulation component should be independent of line departments and directly funded from industry levies. So almost saying we don't want to fund ICASA anymore. The broadcasters, I suppose ourselves, should be paying levies to ICASA directly.
I think that this is part of the way to lessen the burden on the fiscus, because in recent times, of course, we know, which is very different to the situation that we found ourselves before the global financial crisis in 2008, where we had a surplus in our fiscus and we were able to spend ourselves out of recession. In 2009, negative contraction 1.5. 2010, also included by the 2010 World Cup, we grew by 3.5%. Whereas in this particular instance, we don't necessarily have that luxury. And one of those reasons why I would think that policy recommendation, he stipulates that in his report, would be to offset the reliance on the national fiscus to ensure that whichever streams are able to generate revenue sustainably for themselves, so as to lessen the burden on the fiscus. I think that was probably the thinking around.
Are you picking a pattern here? I mean, even with Eskom, he says over-reliance on municipal budgets on electricity revenue needs to be corrected. More and more, seemingly he's saying, okay, stop relying on government to carry it.
Indeed, and that becomes quite a contentious issue, because municipalities and local government, one of the biggest sources of their revenue is from water tariffs and electricity. The other rates and taxes and so on, and of course their proportional share that they get from National Treasury, really, and also given how the local municipalities are governed currently, serves really as a break even towards servicing some of the debt obligations or operational obligations that municipalities have. So I would assume that will be quite a contentious proposition in that respect, because a lot of the revenues, and I think that's also why there's been a contentious or a lack of wanting to take up this diversified or mixed approach towards energy supply, because it will be a loss of revenue for Eskom, it becomes a loss of revenue for municipalities as well. It then beckons the question, how will the municipalities able to generate additional revenue on top of their proportional share from Treasury?
How is this going to be received by the transport sector? He seemingly says, Open up the ports, open up the rails, get third parties. They must have access to this rail network, and let's have competition going.
I think, of course, whilst trade openness has been one of the panaceas that has aided us to get to the point where we are, but it's also important for government to choose winners in terms of specific sectors. Because whilst we need to ensure that we're competitive globally with other industries, what we do know is that where countries are most competitive in specific sectors than their peers globally is primarily because the government has intervened and said we are choosing these specific industry winners by de-risking them where a private sector does not want to invest. We de-risk them and we ensure that we create that conducive environment that will enable that competition even for domestic players. So I think the devil becomes in the detail as to how it is done, the mechanics thereof, and ensuring that those sectors that are chosen as winners, which in my view would be the high employment multiplier sectors in this regard, should be the ones with respect to trade. Consider those nuances. Alternatively, it might just lead to an additional loss of jobs if we don't think about it more carefully.
Because there's some attention that he's putting to public transport as well, because the idea is that people live far away from work, but if we have an effective public transport system, that will be able at least to close the gap and people will be able to get to work in an affordable way.
Certainly, and that's also quite intricately linked to the issue of human settlements and spatial integration, which is quite important, and I think it's a short win in this respect, because what we've seen, one of the biggest contributors to our increase in GDP per capita over the recent years has been this equitable transfer in property through RDP housing to South Africans. That's what significantly contributed, accompanied by social welfare and so on and so forth. And we see that when there's automatically that equity transfer through property and of course integrated transportation systems, of course now people have some level on the human settlement side, some form of collateral to access capital, which stimulates aggregate demand, but also they're able to source employment opportunities closer to where economic activity is happening, but as well economic activity is able to be stimulated due to this renewed integration of the transportation sector. So I think that's quite an important consideration in that respect.
Hadebe, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming through and helping us navigate this 77-page. It's quite intense one. It's quite meaty. Get into it as well and just get to understand some of the details of what is being proposed here. And of course, a call has been made for you to interact with this and make your submissions on this particular blueprint and what you think of it.